Dark Souls 3 is my favorite game in the trilogy, and today I'm going to add my take to the endless sea of pretentious FromSoft ass-kissing, because I have yet to kiss any ass myself. Now, very importantly, I want to stress this point into oblivion. I'm not here to say that Dark Souls 3 is necessarily the best in the trilogy, only that it's my favorite. Video games, arguably more than other mediums, are a very personal experience. When you start a game, particularly an RPG, you're signing up for a 40 to several hundred hour experience, and that experience is inherently going to be less curated than with other forms of media. Every second of a film or book is intentional, but game developers have to put a lot of faith in the people who play their games. They can build worlds and stories and vistas, but the power to see those things is in the hands of players. So we function to some extent like co-directors. We curate the experience for ourselves. This video isn't a review, and it's also not an attempt to convince anyone else that Dark Souls 3 is supposed to be their favorite. I'm going to talk about the things that I think Dark Souls 3 does well, and because the things it does well are important to me, it's my favorite in the trilogy. So with that out of the way, let's get started. The Dark Souls games, in spite of their differences, all focus on roughly the same activity. Kill the dudes, do the thing. So if most or all of the game centers around hunting some dudes, then the dudes you're hunting are really, really important. And this is where the famed FromSoft environmental storytelling comes into play. Every time I play Dark Souls 1, I have to kill the four kings, but to do that, I need to journey through New Londo, and on that journey I have an opportunity to learn about the dead world around me, about its death and about its life. This method of storytelling is deeply engaging, and to this day it's the biggest thing I appreciate about Dark Souls 1's world and level design. The Metroidvania style of gameplay is one built around observation, close attention to the minutiae of your surroundings, and that attention paves the way for observation and questioning. I think that's also one reason why the transition away from interconnectivity doesn't bother me so much in the sequels, because what I appreciate about that approach to level design is how it forces me to look at the world, carefully and slowly, and I don't think that aspect was lost at any point in the trilogy. Now, in spite of the deeply engaging way these boss stories get told, and in spite of the beauty of the boss stories themselves, I do think they have one arguable flaw that Dark Souls 3 remedies. And that's that it doesn't always mean much that the bosses have to die. Kingseeker Frampt will tell you that you need not feel guilt over hunting Gwyn's old allies, because they've either outlived their usefulness or turned to the path of the wicked. And to be perfectly honest, I don't see any other way they could have told the story in Dark Souls 1. The nature of the world in the first game was unknown, and so hunting these bosses allowed us to learn. And that's all that I can really ask for the first entry. But it does leave the bosses themselves feeling a bit MacGuffin-y. I have to hunt them for their power. That's true across all three games, but in Dark Souls 1 and 2, it doesn't mean much that they have to die. Their story was already told. I'm here to uncover it and kill them. But in Dark Souls 3, the Lords of Cinder, while functionally identical, are a lot more active in the narrative. That these beings are the Lords of Cinder, that they have linked the fire before and refuse to link it again, that means everything, because it means they must die for who they are, and not only for who they were. To me, this bears out in the kind of emotions I feel about the bosses. And this was true at times in the other games, Gwyn in Dark Souls 1, and Nishandra and Aldia in Dark Souls 2, but in Dark Souls 3, it's a quality belonging to all four Lord of Cinder fights, and to me that makes the core narrative feel more focused, and it also creates a more personal relationship to the Lords of Cinder than I typically felt in the other games. The Dark Souls trilogy, I'd argue, is a very natural series to digest because, to me, it's really one story just spread over three parts. Dark Souls 1 introduced us to the world and to the Age of Fire. We knew that it was fading, and we also kept dying, so things did indeed seem very dire. Linking the fire, we were told, would save it. Of course, that's an oversimplification. There were always tons of clues in the game that the information afforded to us was incomplete. But it's easy to forget anymore that until a sequel was announced, there was no real way of knowing whether linking the fire had done it, whether the day was really saved. So Dark Souls 2 comes out, and now the world doesn't seem very saved. And what I enjoy about Dark Souls 2 is the way that its characters seem to mirror the response the player might have. Lordran was the kingdom of the gods, and they had everything to gain from the fire, but Drangleic is just ruled by people, and like the player, they've been slapped in the face with the reality of the undead curse. They're quite reluctant to link the fire. I mean, we did that before. It didn't work. Why would we want to do it again? And Drang Lake reflects this. Vendrick never links the fire, he never takes the true throne, and he and his brother Aldia commit themselves to finding a cure to the undead curse, a way to free humans from a cycle that they never had any hand in. And in the end, they fail. Though Aldia, it could be argued, gets closer. He is at least spared the fate of hollowing. But Vendrick does go hollow, and just as before, we walk through that world, the decaying ruins of a great kingdom whose rulers were ultimately helpless to challenge the flame. There are two endings to Dark Souls 2, just as in Dark Souls 1, in fact, but given that Dark Souls 3 exists, I'm going to operate under the assumption that the choice to take the throne, and ultimately link the fire, is the canon choice, and that puts Dark Souls 3 in a really interesting position. Dark Souls 1 shows us the fire, and asks that we link it to save the world, and then Dark Souls 2 comes out, and we learn that there never was any salvation in the fire. But as we uncover the truth about Aldia and Vendrick, it becomes clear that there's no other way. The fire is all that we have. And then Dark Souls 3 comes out. And in Lothric we see decay and corruption on an unprecedented scale. The world is broken in Dark Souls 3. It's literally falling apart at the seams. And should you choose to link the fire at the end of the game, you'll be shown only a flickering ember because the fire was always meant to go out. That's what fires do. The Dark Souls trilogy keeps dangling hope. Frail hope, imperfect hope, but still hope of a sort. And it keeps luring you and saying maybe there's a way, but no matter how many concessions you're willing to make to find peace in the fire, it will not always be there to offer that peace. Like anything that burns bright enough to matter, the fire is going to fade. And in the end, we're going to have to be okay with that. The bosses in Dark Souls 3 are incredible. I don't think that's a hot take. I'm not very knowledgeable when it comes to the more mechanical side of video games, so my analysis here is going to be kind of limited. Instead of breaking them all down, I'm going to focus on the one quality that I think a lot of the fights nail, and that's pacing. The Abyss Watchers are a really great fight. These days they can feel kind of underwhelming, at least in terms of difficulty. Shadow of the Erd Tree and Lies of P kind of turned everyone into this, but even so, I love the Abyss Watchers. During my most recent playthrough, ignore the bloodstain, I'm not good at video games. I felt like I had the most cinematic battle with them ever. And that's because on this run, the pace of the fight was perfect. And to me, that's the sauce behind the best fights in this game. The Abyss Watchers, the Twin Princes, and the Soul of Cinder are the best examples because I think the better you get at them, the cooler they start to look and feel. I don't really know if that's true in the other two games. I'm not jerking off to high-level Nito gameplay, I'm sorry. But the mechanics of the bosses, and particularly the more humanoid bosses in Dark Souls 3, mean the fights turn into a dance once you learn the pattern, and to me that's the coolest feeling in the world. Another big piece of that puzzle is, of course, the music. Dark Souls 3 has my favorite soundtrack of all time, and just like with mechanics, this isn't really my forte. I know very little about music other than how it makes me feel, but I think I can at least point out how the songs seem so frequently to match the pace of their fights mechanically. And I would argue emotionally, but I think that's more subjective. Like I said, I also feel like the music really perfectly matches the emotional and thematic core of each fight. That's a very subjective take, but I can at least give a practical example of that for me. I love the Twin Princes, and they've always been my favorite fight in the game ever since I first played it, but for a very long time I viewed the fight as a sort of simplistic tragedy. And it is a tragedy, but it's not just about the princes. Lothric was born to link the fire, but he abandoned that nightmarish duty and instead fled with his brother to watch the flames fade from afar. His condition is awful, and Lorien's condition is sickening, and that they do not wish to be burned away makes all the sense in the world, so it's a tragedy that I've come to kill them. That is true, but it's also too personal for the tone struck by the music, and it wasn't until thinking about the fight on my own time while listening to the soundtrack that the fight began to truly take on its weight for me. Lothric knows I've come to kill him, and he knows exactly why. As he says, I'm not the first to visit them, and he has no interest in the mantle of Lord. So long as Lothric lives, the fire cannot be linked, and upon his death, so far as he can tell anyway, the world will no longer be spared the suffering of the Age of Fire. Lothric was a prince, born to die, and with his death, the fate of the world is no longer assured. Now it rests again with the Unkindled. So those are some of my thoughts, or at least some very condensed versions of some of my thoughts about Dark Souls 3. Obviously, it's not a comprehensive review or anything, but like I said, I mostly just wanted to talk about some things that stand out to me and some things that make the game really exceptional, in my opinion. So thank you for listening to my unhinged ramble.